Bulavinaka, aloha, and hello from Fiji. I am delighted to welcome you all to this session of the 24-hour environmental law celebrations that focuses on the role of environmental law to address the pollution crisis. This session is organized by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Oceania Regional Office, and will feature the compelling insights of our speakers who are with us today. My name is Maria Ngoretti Muavesi, and I serve as the Senior Environmental Legal Officer for the Oceania Regional Office. I have the pleasure of moderating this session today with my co-moderator, Naima Fifita, who resides in Hawaii and is currently studying environmental law in the Pacific. Pollution is a major challenge to our global community. In the Pacific, it threatens our efforts towards sustainable economies, healthy societies, and a sustainable future for our people. Environmental law and the environmental rule of law have played a critical role in addressing pollution at the global, regional, and national level. This session aims to celebrate the achievements of the environmental rule of law in addressing the pollution crisis, specifically in the Pacific, and at the same time, discuss the continued role it has in creating solutions for now and the future. At this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Mason Smith, who serves as the Regional Director of the Iucn in Oceania, and is based here at Iucn's regional office in Suva, Fiji. Mr. Smith will share about Iucn's role in addressing the pollution crisis in the Pacific and the work of the Pacific Center for Environmental Governance Environmental Law Program, which provides environmental governance support for Pacific Island decision makers and to existing Iucn programs. To our audience, please note that there will be a question and answer session after our speakers have shared their insights. Please use the chat function to submit your questions at any time during the program, and we will be sure to address them. I would also like to remind our speakers that our time together is, of course, too short. Please do your best to refrain from going over time. Mr. Smith, thank you for your time with us today. The floor is yours.
And warm Pacific greetings from Fiji and the vast Oceania region. I'm honored and pleased this morning to provide some remarks for this 24-hour Environmental Rule of Law Symposium to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Montevideo Programme and 50 years of addressing the pollution crisis through international environmental law. Before I begin, I wish to thank UNEP for inviting Iucn Oceania to organize and participate in this session and to be the first to kick off this 24-hour-long symposium. I also thank my fellow speakers who no doubt bring valuable insights in addressing pollution and environmental law. Dear colleagues, dear participants, this morning I will speak to the work of Iucn in relation to pollution in the Pacific and the role of Iucn's Pacific Center for Environmental Governance, which is housed here in Suva, in developing environmental law capacity building initiatives and partnerships to address environmental issues in the Oceania region. You will no doubt agree when I say that pollution is the introduction of harmful materials into the environment. And as you've heard from Maria this morning, pollution threatens our efforts towards sustainable economies, healthy societies, and a sustainable future for our Pacific communities. However, as development and economies sour, our consumption of pollutant-making products continue to increase as well. In these instances, without thought to the environment, we contribute to the introduction of harmful materials into our pristine environment right here in Oceania. Dear colleagues, plastic pollution has no doubt been the most challenging to tackle in the past 40 years. The science is clear. Plastic pollution is a problem that we need to fix. I've been told that approximately 8 to 10 million tons of plastic debris enter the ocean each year, attributed to reasons such as unsustainable behavioral patterns, inexistence or non-enforceable legislation, ineffective waste management systems, and unknown leakage sources. According to some estimates and figures by the United Nations Division for Sustainable Development Goals, it is also anticipated that at the current rates, there will be more plastics in the ocean than there are fishes by the year 2050. Pacific Island countries are one of the main recipients of plastic pollution and its impacts, even though we contribute to only less than 1.3% of the mismanaged plastics in the world's oceans. Since 2004, Iucn has been involved in various initiatives in an effort to address the urgent issue of plastics. Much of this work has centered on research to expand and improve scientific understanding of this complex agenda. Nevertheless, through Iucn's Close the Plastic Gap initiative, a number of projects have been implemented to advance 6 key pillars: partnerships, knowledge, capacity building, policy, business, and innovation. These pillars are the core of the Iucn work that we have been developing with partners and others in different regions globally. Dear colleagues, here in the Pacific Waste-Free Islands Project is a 3-year initiative that is being implemented in Fiji, Samoa, and Vanuatu, and in Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Grenada in the Caribbean, with the support from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. This project seeks to promote island circular economies and to demonstrate effective, quantifiable solutions to addressing plastic leakage from small island developing states. The project aims to repurpose waste into commercially viable products, thereby generating job opportunities and income for local communities. Key stakeholders from governments, private sector, civil society are united in a vibrant learning and leadership network, which will co-generate and demonstrate demand-responsive solutions to plastic waste, incorporating policy, business, operations, and more importantly, citizen behavior changes. This will allow Iucn to generate a vibrant community with players from all levels of society in order to generate a wide range of tools to replicate the approach in other islands, not only in the Oceania region, but globally. Dear colleagues, as part of this project activity, a quantification and material flow analysis was conducted in the 3 project countries in Oceania way back in 2019. In Fiji, the study found that around 19,667 tons of plastic material was imported into the country, and from these, 4,880 tons was leaked into the environment. The data revealed that around 40% of the leaked plastics waste come from the household sector, which is equivalent to around 1,939 tons of plastic waste. And 45% come from commercial businesses, equivalent to about 2,205 tons of plastic waste. The study also found in Fiji that around 2.45% of commercial plastic waste is unfortunately been burnt. The analysis also found that the fishery sector leaked around 2.9 tons of consumable plastics and around 19.9 tons of fishing gear into the environment. In Fiji, in the tourism sector, the analysis found that tourists generate 7 times more plastic waste per person a day than a Fijian resident. And 13% of tourism waste is plastic, with a total leakage of around 733 tons of plastic per year leaked from the tourism sector. In Vanuatu, a total of 4,698 tons of plastic material were imported into Vanuatu in 2019, of which 2,846 tons were leaked into the environment. The analysis revealed that the highest amount of plastic leakage was from household at around 1,341 tons of plastic waste, followed by commercial businesses that leaked around 901 tons of plastic per year. Across the residential and commercial sectors, plastic waste comprised 9.8% overall and was made up of 36% LDPE and 21.2% PET plastic types. In Vanuatu, the tourism sector was found to have leaked around 515 tons of plastics per year, with a total of 90 tons of consumer plastics leaked from the fisheries sector per year, with an additional 6.3 tons of fishing gear. In the tourism sector in Vanuatu, it was revealed that the most dominant waste time was airline waste in plastics at 56.1%. Additionally, the study also found that fisheries waste contributed 3.3% of all plastic waste disposed of in Vanuatu. In Samoa, the analysis found that 4,243 tons of plastic material was imported into Samoa in 2019. From this value, around 1,864 tons was leaked, stockpiled, or in long-term reservoirs, all in the environment. Similar to Vanuatu, the analysis in Samoa found that the household sector was the leading source of plastic leakage into the environment, leaking 1,014 tons of plastic per year. This was followed by commercial businesses, leaking 614 tons of plastic per year, and then the tourism sector, leaking over 234 tons of plastics into the environment. Similar to Vanuatu and Fiji, the fisheries sector was revealed to have the least amount of leakage into the environment at 0.2 tons of plastic consumables and 0.7 tons of fishing gear per year. Ladies and gentlemen, international environmental law has achieved a lot in the past 40 years in addressing the pollution crisis. The Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and their disposal, the Rotterdam Convention on the Prior Informed Consent Procedure for certain hazardous chemicals, and the pesticides in international trade. Agreements are among some of the multilateral treaties adopted to address pollution. Most, if not all, countries in the Pacific have adopted these conventions. At the regional level, the convention to ban the importation into foreign island countries of hazardous and radioactive waste and to control the transboundary movement of hazardous waste within the South Pacific region was adopted to implement the Basel Convention at the regional level. Most recently, and in a move to address plastic pollution, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, UNEA, during its resumed fifth session, requested in Resolution 5/14 the Executive Director to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee with the mandate to develop an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the maritime environment, commencing its work during the second half of 2022, with the ambition of completing its work by the end of 2024. This meeting is happening right now in Dakar, Senegal, and we congratulate UNEP for its efforts on this. Dear colleagues, the Montevideo Environmental Programme objectives aims to support the development of adequate and effective environmental legislation and legal frameworks at all levels to address environmental issues. It also aims to strengthen the effective implementation of environmental law at the national level, support enhanced capacity building for increased effectiveness on environmental law for all stakeholders at all levels, support national governments upon their request in the development and implementation of the environmental rule of law, and promote the role of environmental law in the context of effective environmental governance. This aligns well with Iucn's priority areas of the inaugural Iucn Oceania Environmental Law Congress of 2021, which is implemented by the Pacific Center for Environmental Governance together with its partners. It aims to support the development of adequate and effective environmental legislation as recommended by the UNEP 5th Montevideo Environmental Law Programme for the development and periodic review of environmental law, and is in line with the findings of the assessment and gap analysis on environmental legal frameworks in the Pacific Island countries. Iucn and UNEP have established a great collaborative partnership with other stakeholders, including ADB, the World Commission on Environmental Law, Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, and the Pacific Network for Environmental Law, with the aim of implementing its shared goals and objectives in the area of environmental law. These have included collaboration on the inaugural Iucn Oceania Environmental Law Conference in 2021 and the implementation of key recommendations from the 2019 Asia Pacific Judicial Conference on Climate and Environment Adjudication, which includes the following. First, capacity building for judiciaries in the Pacific. To this end, Iucn and UNEP, together with the UN Office of the High Human Rights Commissioner, Pacific Regional Office, and the Papua New Guinea Center for Judicial Excellence, conducted a training for Pacific judges on environment and climate law in the Pacific. The training was based on an introductory course on environment and climate law for judges and lawyers that UNEP, FELA, and Iucn Oceania developed. Following this training, Iucn and UNEP will collaborate to develop an intermediary course for judges and lawyers in the Pacific as a follow-up to the introductory course. Secondly, the establishment of a Pacific Green Bench. To this end, Iucn, UNEP, and ADB are working together to commence assessment work on this recommendation. And third, to create a network for Pacific judges in the Pacific. To this end, Iucn, UNEP, and ADB are hopeful that this network will be a result of the capacity building initiative undertaken with members of the judiciary. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue to foster this relationship and collaborate with us, other stakeholders in the region and beyond, with the same shared goals of advancing the environmental rule of law in the region and build the necessary capacity required by Pacific Island countries to effectively implement environmental legislation and policies. To end my intervention, I want to echo the message of Inga Anderson, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, on the first day of the meeting of the ad hoc open-ended working group to develop an international legal binding instrument on plastic pollution, in which he underscored the need for all stakeholders in addressing plastic pollution to, and I quote, seeing in the same direction, and highlighted the importance of a full cycle approach, including eliminating pollution of unnecessary plastic products, called for system-wide change and investing in circularity, and emphasized that the scale of change needed is enormous. Ladies and gentlemen, this message rings true for capacity needs for the effective implementation and enforcement of environmental legislation in the Pacific. At this juncture, I wish to reiterate the importance of implementing the idea to establish the Oceania Environmental Law Global Partnerships that was first introduced by Professor Dennis Antonelli at the World Conservation Congress. More information will be shared through a video that will be played at the end of this session. Iucn cannot do it alone, so I emphasize for partnerships and collaborations that it be made now, and we look forward to future collaborations and formalizing these partnerships. I round off these remarks and wish you well in the next 24 hours of celebrating the environmental rule of law and celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Montevideo Programme and 50 years of addressing the pollution crisis through international environmental law. Thank you for your time. Binaka Vakalevu.
Thank you, Mason, for your intervention. Plastic pollution is indeed a global problem, and we welcome the efforts of UNEP and all state members of UNEA towards the new internationally legally binding agreement for plastics. You are welcome to follow the outcomes of the ad hoc ended working group, which is currently undertaken in Dakar, Senegal. Next, we will turn to our second speaker, Ms. Patricia Parkinson, an environmental law and international law specialist with 20 years of experience working in Southeast Asia and the Pacific on technical assistance and capacity building development projects. In 2018, she founded the Environmental Law Oceania Consultancy. Her recent work has focused primarily on strengthening the international and national policy legal frameworks for the prevention of plastic pollution in the Pacific Islands. Today, we are grateful to have her with us to discuss how we might shape a global and comprehensive treaty to end plastic pollution. Ms. Parkinson, welcome.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to UNEP, ARIEL, and of course Iucn for inviting me to speak this morning for us here in Fiji. And good morning, good afternoon, good night to you all. There was a very good introduction by Mason and also Maria on the topic that I'm going to speak to today, and hopefully try to keep it short, 15 minutes. And I'm going to talk about the shaping of a global and comprehensive treaty to end plastic pollution. Next slide. All right, so as it was introduced by Mason, there is a new agreement in the making, and that started like 2014 at the first meeting of Iucn had the discussions about it. But the decision to actually start the work on a new treaty to end plastic pollution was taken only this year at the last UNEA meeting in Nairobi in 2022, and with the adoption of the resolution 514, the resolution to end plastic pollution. Next. So this resolution, that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the framework that is given by this resolution, which is the result of a lot of work in preparation, to give an initial architecture for the negotiations. Because now that the real hard work is beginning. So the main instrument, or the main institutional entity for negotiating that was the treaty, was the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that was established by UNEP and to start the negotiations on the treaty. So the INC, as we call it for short, is mandated to develop an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, and that also includes microplastics. And the resolution guides the framework or the work of the INC. Next. So before the first meeting of the INC, as was mentioned by Mason and also by Maria, at this moment, as we're talking now, there's the meeting of the ad hoc open-ended working group is taking place in Dakar, Senegal. And this working group has the task of preparing for the first meeting of the INC and the subsequent meetings. So the UNEP Secretariat had a very important role to play in preparing in what will be discussed during this meeting that is taking place over 3 days at the moment. So it includes giving consideration to the timetable of sessions for the INC, how to cluster and organize the work of the INC, also to consider requesting UNEP Secretariat to draw on its previous experience of negotiations of MEAs to prepare the draft elements and options for the structure of the instrument. And that would be considered by the INC in its first meeting. Also, the UNEP Secretariat suggests that the open-ended working group ask the Secretariat to provide guidance on a multi-stakeholder action agenda to engage with all stakeholders, because that's a very important element of the resolution, is that it's important that everyone is involved. Okay, next. So there's an initial timeline given for the negotiation of the treaty, and that's so the INC is to begin work in the second half of this year, and the ambition is to complete its work by the end of 2024. So that's just over 2 years. It's really a short time by international treaty negotiation standards. Some treaties have taken like 10 years, such as the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. It took a very long time in the making. But we need action urgently, and hopefully these timetables can be kept. So there are two options that are proposed for the negotiations. Is either it's going to be 5 negotiating sessions of the ANC, which would give more time for negotiation among the member states. Or there would be another option is 4 negotiating sessions that would allow more time for the intersessional work and to gather all the information that is needed. So it's a question of balance between, you know, the time of negotiation between the parties, the members of the ANC, and also the time needed in between the sessions to prepare for these negotiation meetings. Hopefully, the new treaty will be open for signature at a diplomatic conference of plenipotentiaries that would be convened in 2025. Next. There's also a provision in the resolution for a stakeholders forum. As I mentioned before, it's important to have all stakeholders involved. And for that purpose, it is proposed to have a stakeholders forum to be convened before the first meeting of the ANC. And so that the outcome of that multi-stakeholders forum can be reported to the first meeting of the ANC. Next. Really, the crunch of the resolution lies in the operative paragraph, OP3 and OP4 of the resolution. And that is guiding the work of the ANC. It includes key principles and factors and provisions that should be considered during the deliberations of the ANC. So they relate, they can be clustered in 3 groups, really: the scope of the instruments and the approach to be adopted, the key provisions to be included in the instrument, and also some key considerations that should be given by the ANC while developing these provisions and choosing the approach. Next. So I will try to hopefully quickly go through these 3 categories of issues or matters to be considered. First is the scope of the instrument and the approach to be adopted. The resolution calls for the instrument on plastic pollution to be developed based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic. And that was response to the current governance regime of plastic, which main flaw is that it is fragmented. It is across various international, regional instruments, and it has proved unable to address effectively the issue of plastic pollution, mainly because it's focused primarily on the end of the life cycle. Plastic as a waste problem. The waste problem is important, but that's when the idea of turning the tap comes from, is that if we address only the end, we won't be able to keep mopping the plastic that pollutes our environment and our oceans. We need to take the issue from the source and address it from the source. Okay, next. An interesting characteristic of the instrument that will be developed is that it will be primarily an international legally binding instrument, and that's what most of the countries called for, but it will also include voluntary provisions. So it's a combination of legally binding instruments with obligations binding on the countries, but also includes all the voluntary tools that can be used to address plastic pollution. So it gives it some flexibility. Next. Still in the scope and approach, another provision is to take into account, among other things, the principle of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, as well as national circumstances and capabilities. So the Rio principles that were adopted at the Rio conference in 1992, they're really an essential foundation of environmental law, and the principles are found in many MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. In particular, the precautionary principle, which is the principle 15 of the Rio Declaration, and the polluter pays principle, which is important also as it gives a legal basis to the concept of extended producer responsibility, which might be a very effective tool to address plastic pollution. As well is a duty to prevent transboundary harm, which is the principle 2 of the Rio Declaration and was already preempted by the Stockholm Declaration. And the principle of cooperation and common but differentiated responsibilities. That is principle 7 of the Rio Declaration. It basically acknowledges that some developed countries are more responsible for the current environmental crisis as more responsible than developed countries, and that that comes with responsibilities and to provide assistance in addressing the problem, assistance to developed countries. Next. All right. Key provisions. So I've grouped them by theme. Well, the first key provisions to be included, considered by the INC for inclusion in the instruments is to specify the objectives of the instruments. And the objective is a very important part of any MEAs because really they capture what's essential purpose of the instrument, and they also guide, the following instruments, like any protocol that might be adopted to support the implementation of the objectives. It's an essential reference. Key provision is also to promote sustainable production and consumption of plastic through, among other things, product design and environmentally sound waste management, including through resource efficiency and circular economy approaches. So the circular economy is something that has been very much discussed during all the preparatory work of the, the Hague meetings and the meetings of the UNEA, and which is really the only solution to address effectively plastic pollution. There's actually a report that has been done of what can be achieved through resource efficiency and circular economy, and really it could provide the required answer. There's going to be some, if my PowerPoint presentation is shared, there's going to be some reference to that report. And also I didn't mention the sustainable production and consumption is a reference to SDG 12. Okay, let's move because I can see that my time is coming up soon. Other key provisions relate to national obligations. they are to relate to national obligations. Just a reminder, I'm talking about the key provisions that are preempted in the resolutions for consideration by the ANC and inclusion in the instrument. So it talks about develop, implementation and update national action plans to reflect country-driven approaches to contribute to the objectives of the instrument. And also, and the action plan should be really prioritizing the prevention and reduction, as well as reduction and elimination of plastic pollution, and as well as promoting regional and international cooperation. There must be some national reporting obligations also. Next. It is important when there's an instrument to regularly assess how it's doing, how effective it is, and so there should be some provisions for the assessment of the implementation and of the effectiveness. Next. Knowledge is going to be also a big focus. We can only manage what we know. And so that there's a few provisions relating to knowledge, generation of better knowledge on the issue of plastic pollution, but also exchange of knowledge and awareness raising, capacity building, and what's very important for developing countries in some technical assistance and as well as financial assistance and technology transfer, all on mutually agreed terms. Okay, next. There's some key provision to be developed in relation to cooperation and coordination among all stakeholders. We've seen that the current governance regime was fragmented, and so the new instrument is really developed to address that problem. And there are also existing instruments, as we mentioned before, in relation to hazardous waste, in relation to pollution from ships, etc. So they should all be working together for addressing better the problems, and also include all stakeholders. Next. All right, so there's also a key provision should address compliance. There's no real detail on how it should be addressed, and that's something for deliberation, but there is the negotiators can rely on existing MEAs, instruments for compliance, how to support compliance, including monitoring, reporting obligation, compliance assistance, etc. Also, dispute resolution mechanism would assist with compliance. So no time to deep into that, so we go to the next slide. Implementation is also as part of the matters to be considered. So it's not in the category of provisions, in the category of matters to be considered by the ANC. So that's the operative paragraph 4 in the resolution. So implementation, so we've seen there must be obligations, but also voluntary approaches. Implementation will be supported with a financial mechanism to support the implementation, including consideration should be given to a dedicated multilateral fund. And also as part of the implementation, there's a concept of flexibility with a common, on the basis of the common but differentiated responsibilities. And so there will be some discretion in the implementation of the commitments to take into account the national circumstances. Next. Collating best knowledge will be important also for the effectiveness of the instrument. So there's consideration of the best available science traditional knowledge, a recognition of the role of the indigenous people and local knowledge system, lessons learned and best practices, including from the informal settings, possibility for mechanisms to provide policy relevant scientific and socio-economic information and assessment. That was a key provision, mentioned that before, but consideration should be given to what could be a mechanism for that. So that could be maybe a clearinghouse or other mechanism that can be set up for this knowledge generation and sharing. And conclusion, just 5 minutes over time, is well, just consider that 2 years is a very ambitious agenda, and it's going to require really good focus, and it might be possible just because so much work has been done already in the preparation for the resolution. So let's hope that it can be achieved, and that by 2025 we have an international instrument that would really help internationally, but also at national and local level for addressing effectively plastic pollution. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to the next presentation within this session and the following sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Parkinson, for your intervention on the work of the INC and its upcoming endeavors to develop comprehensive treaties on this issue, and for sharing about the importance of organizational collaboration and internationally legally binding instruments in implementing frameworks to end plastic pollution. Now we turn to the Director General of the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Programme, Mr. Stefanaya Nawandra, who will be looking at some of the wins and challenges of that the Pacific continues to face with addressing pollution, and the role the law plays in contributing to solutions. Mr. Nawandra, please proceed.
Thank you. Ulbinaka Georgie, good to see you briefly when you started the session. I've just been on the job with SPREP as Director General for the last 2 months, so it's a new role for me, but it's not a new place for me to work. I've worked there previously, and I've done a lot of work also with many of the Pacific Island countries in various roles that I've played. While I'm an engineer by background, I've worked in policy and legislation for maybe around 25 years, so I feel comfortable talking about it, I guess. I won't go into details like Mason and Patricia have done. Maybe what I can contribute is just some experiences that I've had working in this space over the last 30 years. I'd like to start with foundations for doing marine pollution work or marine environment work. We celebrate this year Stockholm plus 50. 1972 was really the start of all the work on environment globally at the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. 1972 was also the year UNEP was started. Here in the Pacific, the work here started in 1974 out of SPC, where UNEP started a coral reef program based out of SPC. And soon after that, when the regional seas programs were started by UNEP, we started talking about having a regional seas program here in the Pacific in the late 70s. In 1986, the countries in the Pacific agreed to have our regional seas program here. And it's called the Iucn Convention. And SPREP doubles as the secretariat of the Iucn Convention. So in a lot of ways, the celebration of Stockholm is also a celebration of, at SPREP, of the formation or the idea of having SPREP. The Iucn Convention itself is part of, I think there are 18 regional seas conventions around the world. And they form a network of what I'd call the foundation for all of the work on marine pollution, marine litter, plastics, that things that come later have built on. Last week, they were having the annual meeting of the Regional Seas Conventions, and I joined virtually. Unfortunately, they were meeting in the Seychelles. Would have been nice to be able to go, but I had to join virtually. But it was interesting just sharing the experiences we've had here in the Pacific. Sometimes we feel we're far away from everything else, but in many ways we are quite advanced in what we've been doing. The Secretariat itself, SPREP, has a staff of 150 now, and we've got offices in 4 countries. And it's much bigger than most of the other regional seas conventions. And it shows the importance that our members place on the work that is being done in the environment, and in particular on marine pollution and waste. I'd just like to reflect on how we can draw from experiences from other areas of work in environmental law. After Rio +20, there was a real change in environmental governance at the global level, at least from a UNEP perspective. Before taking on this Director General role at SPREP, I was head of the UNEP Pacific office for 7 years, or since its formation. 2 things came out of Rio +20 that really helped Pacific engagement with UNEP. The first was the formation of UNEA, UN Environment Assembly, because prior to UNEA, most of the governance of UNEP was done through the Committee of Permanent Representatives. This is primarily a group of ambassadors who have missions in Nairobi. And they were the ones who really governed UNEP. And one of the reasons why Rio +20 decided to have a UN Environment Assembly was to allow countries like us in the Pacific, who have no representation in Nairobi, to become more involved in the governance of UNEP. The other thing that came out of Rio +20 was the formation of UNEP sub-regional offices. And we here in the Pacific was one of the 8 sub-regions that benefited from that decision. When UNEA started, the first UNEA was basically more of the same. It was basically a group of environmental people who came and had discussions, mostly around technical issues. Second UNEA was a bit different. Third UNEA, there was a real change. It was almost like going to a climate change conference. There were a lot more people from foreign affairs, especially the missions in New York. And I must say it was a struggle for UNEP as the Secretariat to handle that UNEA, because it was a real change. And it's something that I think will benefit us in the environment area very much going forward, because now we're really entering real negotiations. I was one of the negotiators for Fiji for the CBD and the UNFCCC when we had the first INCs, together with a prominent lawyer here, Everett Leong. And I remember when I went to the first INC I attended before I think it was the 13th or 14th INC. And I went to Foreign Affairs here in Fiji and asked for, okay, what's my brief? What do I go and do? And there was an old gentleman from English, but resident or Fiji citizen called Ian Perks. And he turned around and told me, why are you asking me? You're supposed to be the expert. So we went to New York without a clear position on what we wanted to do as a country. And when Fiji chaired the UNFCCC at COP26, we had a preparatory meeting here in Suva. And they asked me to say a few words as one of those who was involved at the beginning. And all I said was I couldn't believe how far we had come in terms of preparations, amount of people involved. Because at the end of the day, conventions and law is all about governments. It's not really about us who work outside of government. We help them to do it, but it's really a matter for governments to do. So what we need to do is prepare our governments well to engage in those processes. Patricia touched on the issue of UNEA 5.2 and the process of getting that resolution passed. In the Pacific, there are only 2 delegations at that UNEA, just Fiji and FSM, one of the lawyers from their mission in New York attended in person. So they were the front people who were helping the others to do a lot of the discussions, because those negotiations are not attended by us, people who work in the IGOs or NGOs or private sector. It's basically just governments in the room. But what we had around them was a support network that was connecting to them through WhatsApp and helping them to do the negotiations. And that's what we need to do as small island states and as regions to support our negotiators. Because those that we are negotiating with often come with big delegations. They have their technical people there. That's where we have also benefited from the experience that we've had in climate change. At the last Glasgow COP, many Pacific islands were not able to go. But what the Pacific did was we appointed political champions and we gave them the right to speak for us as a region. So that may be a way to go in the future because we don't know what will be happening. One of the things too that we need to strengthen here in the Pacific is the linkages with our missions in New York and in other parts of the world, because they're the ones who really do the negotiations. A lot of these negotiations happen outside session. When you come to the COPs themselves, it's what I often say, sometimes there's a lot of razzmatazz on the outside, but the real negotiations work has 90% of it is already done. So if you haven't done your homework before the COPs, very sorry, you won't get much in. So that's what we need to understand and address in our region. And it's something that we have been working on for this INC process for marine litter and plastics. It's something that SPREP will lead, and we will work with our partners, NGO community, the universities. We already have a good network through the Cleaner Pacific, and that will help us to support our negotiators, because they need all of us to be behind them. They're the ones who are there fronting up on our behalf, and we need to have them prepared. We need to also understand that there are like-minded groupings that we can help. We can use to help us push what we need to do. AOSIS, this is something that started as a climate change grouping, but it's used across the board now. In 2 weeks' time, I'll be in Geneva for the BRS COP, and to sign a project that a global project that we are doing with a number of the other two SIDS regions. But I'll be taking the opportunity to talk to our missions in Geneva, because there are things that are happening in Geneva too that impact on the environment space. Things like trade, meteorology, or weather officers are there. And the same with the missions in Brussels. So it's really something we need to do to ensure that we're all working together to negotiate or to effectively engage in all these global processes. And because we're small, we have to be a bit smarter with the way we do things. We can't do what the bigger countries do and have big teams that go to these negotiations. From Brussels, I'll also be going down to Lisbon for the Oceans Conference. There's a crop-wide preparation for that. We've had a scoping workshop before this, and there's an event organized next week by the Forum Secretariat to help prepare the Pacific for that event. And it's something that we've always taken a lead from the Pacific, so we need to continue to do that. I think Mason touched on, and Patricia also touched on UNCLOS. UNCLOS was another convention that the Pacific led. The first country to become a party to UNCLOS, I think, was Fiji. And the first Secretary General was from Fiji, the ambassador who led that process in New York for us. And the first Oceans Conference was co-hosted by Fiji on behalf of the Pacific. So we need to continue to engage and lead on the oceans, because our region is basically what our leaders call the Blue Pacific continent. And it's the equivalent of the area of China, Canada, and the USA, the land area of China, Canada, and the USA combined. So it's a huge area. And one of the things about, or the peculiarities of our regional sea convention here in the Pacific, is that it includes areas beyond national jurisdiction. It's only one of the 5 regional seas conventions that does that. So there's a lot of opportunities here, but we need to ensure that we are doing the right things to manage our EEZs appropriately. I'd just like to maybe spend a couple of minutes on what I call outliers, things that fall outside the context of MEAs. One of them is fishing vessels. They fall outside the net in terms of their size or their tonnage. The other peculiarity of maritime law is that it doesn't rely on governments or coastal states or port states. You have certain rights, but really it is the flag state that has jurisdiction. So that has its own challenges. There's some challenges with countries in the Pacific who have flags, and it's something that we are working on to help them be more effective flags. But in terms of fishing vessels, the issue with fishing vessels is a lot of them fall outside the size that are governed through the IMO conventions. And that's basically why you see derelict fishing vessels all around the Pacific, because they do not need to meet, or they don't strictly meet these international regulations that they need to be meeting. The other outlier that I wanted to just bring out is the whole issue of World War II wrecks, or legacy from the wars, and to some extent also from the nuclear. It's something that we have here in the Pacific, something we struggle with politically, but also legally. The challenge with World War II wrecks is that legally they still belong to the countries that own them. In the, I think it was the early 2000s, I was up in the outer islands of Iucn in Micronesia, working with the US Navy to pump out a tanker that had been sunk by the Japanese. And the tanker was also a war grave. So that had other elements that had to be looked into. But it's the only wreck we've ever salvaged, because the normal rules of salvage don't apply. You have to get the okay of the governments in order to do any work on them. There's a lot of World War II wrecks around the Pacific. We are thankful to the Australians for providing some funding to be able to start addressing it. The nuclear issue, I think it came up again because of the proposed discharges from Fukushima. It's something that governments in the Pacific are quite concerned about, and it's something that's still being discussed. A lot of the technical work has been done, but it becomes a question of what gives comfort to people in order to give assurance that our communities and populations are safe. And it's something that we will continue to discuss until we get that level of assurance. Finally, I just want to touch on private sector involvement. It's something that really needs to be beefed up and facilitated. We have a wonderful example here in the Pacific where waste is shipped free of charge to countries outside the Pacific. But we need to organize ourselves to be able to ensure the shipper that somebody is at the other side to receive it. It's in a partnership between SPREP and Swire Shipping. It's been in place for about 5-6 years now. And it's something that the rest of the world has taken notice of. So we're trying to expand that agreement to be a global compact involving shipping throughout SIDS regions up to outside ports, so that at least we handle that part of the supply chain in terms of getting or moving waste from where it's not wanted to areas where it can be handled and disposed of properly. And it's something that we need to encourage our lawmakers to help facilitate through the legislation that they put in place, and both at the national and at the global level. Thank you very much. I hope I stuck to time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nawandra. Last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Sanoveva Mauli, who currently serves as the chair of the Solomon Islands Environmental Law Association. And she is here to share about the role of environmental law and pollution from the perspective of the Solomon Islands. Again, please note that the chat box is open to all questions and comments. As Ms. Mauli will conclude our speaker presentations, we will move into our Q&A session once she is done. Ms. Mauli, thank you for being here with us today. What can you tell us about the work of the Solomon Islands Environmental Law Association and how they approach the pollution crisis?
Thank you again for the introduction. Good fellow morning from Honiara, from Solomon Islands. As introduced, my name is Sanoveva Mauli. I've been the chair for the Solomon Island Environmental Law for almost 7 years. I've been in this role. I've worked within the non-government sector for almost a decade before pursuing a PhD in law at the University of Wollongong. So I'm almost there with that. Thankfully, COVID has given me the reasons of taking that time too. But yeah, as earlier introduced, the Solomon Island Environmental Law, its focus has been very much on sustainable resource management awareness. So our role in the last 2 years or so was developing a community legal awareness toolkit, which compromises of the 5 environmental law frameworks, which are mandated for the different environmental related agency, national agencies, which are the government ministries of the Solomon Island government. So in that one kit, the task was to pull together the different processes to name how a community could work through obtaining the development consent, and also understandably being a country which has been challenged with numerous development issues regarding the environment, to name logging and mining in the recent decades. The attention of this toolkit was to have a package of which we could take to the communities. So our attention then has been very much on providing legal awareness at the community level, with the objectives, which was to share legal information and hopefully educate communities on the rules of law, and giving them that context of what the requirements are in terms of a developer and what their rights are as resource owners of their natural resources. And in that, we've rolled out numerous awarenesses. However, over the years, we've identified a number of challenges. To give you a context, as you're well aware, Solomon Islands is a country in the Pacific that is made up of 9 main islands that stretch over a large archipelago. And in that, 80% of the communities are living, 80% of the population live in the communities. And obviously, similar to other societies in Fiji, Samoa, and Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea, to name our neighbors in the region, we rely a lot on our resources, on our natural resources for daily subsistence needs. So with that, the attention of the kit was to provide that awareness of which communities can be well prepared to make informed decisions in terms of development, in terms of their rights, in how best they could manage the environment. And with that, working closely with our government partners, the Ministry of Environment, and so is the Ministry of Fisheries, our attention has very much been on getting that complex information, as you're well aware, law information, which is quite complex in its own nature, getting that complex information as simple in a context of which communities can better understand. And with that, our attention has been very much on resource management. And these communities have existing governance structures of which have been embedded in these societies for generations, even before contemporary law and the knowledge of Western law came about. But with that, we've worked with a kit of which can harmonize both these frameworks of having the traditional people having their understanding and their right in their own communities of how to manage their environment, but be well aware of these contemporary approaches or processes that can come from engaging with the developer. So with that, we've conducted numerous awarenesses across these communities and have obtained a lot of feedback in the way of which people understand law and the practice of law, which is quite dynamic in that people can understand or grasp or take in information, but it's the practice on which they can enforce law. So there are sites across the country who are practicing community-based resource management approaches. And to date, there are only 2 to 3, 4 sites who've been registered under the Protected Area Act. So they are listed as national sites which are registered under the Act, of which with that, they have a management plan. However, the challenges of these sites then to date, to name one site, is the Annobon Islands, which is the largest rookery leatherback turtle site in our part of the Pacific. So with those sites, they have rangers, local rangers who are representing the communities and are present on this site, ensuring that there is no poaching, there aren't development happening around the area. But the challenges of law in practice is communities understanding their rights and their access to these sites. These have been some of the challenges, and also these ranges in applying enforcement. So those have been some of the challenges of which the environmental law have faced. But all in all, we've led awareness in collaboration with our key partner government agencies, and have been over the years work closely with other development partners who feel the need of integrating the understanding of environmental law in their own work. In terms of plastic pollution, it's very visible in Honiara, and though it's also visible in our provincial centers and in many communities, we hope to work closely with stakeholders in this space. Though resource management has been the emphasis in a lot of our awareness, time and again, with government agencies who've been part of our awareness teams, we've also been emphasizing to communities the importance of managing their waste, plastic waste, in not dumping that off in the nearshore reef, and looking at other ways, other practical approaches. And I wish to uphold initiatives which are currently happening in and around the country. Gizo Plastic Waste, they are a community-based organization in a little island in the western part of the Solomons. They have an active women group there advocating for the recycle and use of plastic. And in Honiara itself, in the national capital, the Ministry of Environment has worked in collaboration with the Honiara City Council in looking at ways of which to address plastic in Honiara. And also to share with you all listening, I've been privileged at the end of last year to partake in a project which is funded by the United Nations Development Programme under the Small Grant Program, of which they're turning plastic to energy. However, and I'll be part of a big cleanup, which is funded by the Solomon Airlines this coming Saturday, in looking at collecting as much plastic in the central part of Honiara and taking that to the center. And we will have this training with the rural training centers. There are institutions which are mostly set up by church denominations, of which they provide basic training to those in the community. So very much community-based sort of sessions for community people. So with that, hoping that there's that other approach on which you could use to practice the use of plastic. So those are initiatives that are around, and at the national level to acknowledge the work of the Ministry of Environment in developing the National Waste Management and Pollution Control Strategy 2017 to 2026, with support from SPREP and the Japanese International Cooperation. So with having those policies up at the national level and working through initiatives to the provincial level, I can acknowledge that there is a lot of effort happening at those levels. But with our attention for the Environmental Law Association, we hope that in the upcoming years, in looking into our strategic plan, we will take our lens further into the control of plastic waste and how we could better work with communities and provide that opportunity or a platform of which those discussions can come. And in that, I acknowledge my colleagues, my first 3 colleagues who've provided a lot of insights on what's happening at the national level, but seeing how, and also at the international level, and seeing how we as a community-based, located in the capital, but can bring law to the language of our communities and to better advocate. With that, thank you again.
Thank you very much, Seno. Could you just do us a little favor so that everyone can see who you are? Could you just turn on your video and then just wave to everyone? Are you able to turn on? Please, Seno.
Well, Maria, I think I've been prohibited by the host. Has anyone I've tried turning on my video earlier. Okay,
All
now
right.
I've been allowed it to.
Okay.
Hello there.
Bulabinaka, Seno, and thank you so much.
Morning, True. Morning, True.
Morning, Monstru Mason. Hello, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Very enthusiastic, the work the Solomon Islands Environmental Law Association have been doing over the last, is it 10 or more years, I believe, that the association has been working in Honiara. So thank you for, again, for expanding on the importance of, introducing the multiple approaches to both understanding environmental law, as well as the practice, in the area of research management. We've come to the end of our session in terms of the speakers. We've had 4 great speakers, noting that they've addressed issues and successes, challenges, and future work in the area of environmental law from international to regional, and of course, right down to the community level. And it's great to have the different perspectives, being shared here today. Mason taking the lead and, sharing about the work of Iucn, particularly in the area of plastics, what we're doing in that area, but also in terms of partnerships and collaborations, which is very important in this region. When we talk about, advancing and strengthening environmental law and how we actually get to support conservationists and their work on the ground, and also to countries, governments, and agencies that work tirelessly to administer the environmental legislations, the capacity that they have. Obviously, that continues to be a challenge. We've had went straight into a conversation with from Patricia in relation to the new treaty that we hope to see in the next 2 years. That's the aim, I believe, the negotiations. This conversation that we're having today is quite timely because the ad hoc open-ended meeting also began yesterday in Senegal. In Dakar. So it's quite an exciting time for environment law, but also for in the area of looking at solutions to address pollution. And Sefa gave a very interesting insight. One is that's very important and that we tend to not talk about a lot, and that is the negotiations and the capacity, particularly from small island developing states. That is a reality that we have. And so again, the messaging around working together, collaboration and partnerships, these are very important for small island developing states, and particularly for us here in the Pacific And so thank you very much, Sefa, for sharing that with us. And we hope that we can always, continue to include that as part of our capacity building initiatives around, environmental law. Negotiation is very important at the international level. And again, we need to work with mission officers around the globe that represent countries from the Pacific at these international meetings. So there's a lot that's happening this year that's coming up, a number of meetings, and we hope that we can support that. And of course, Seno shared a lot about the Environmental Law Association and the work that it has done in Honiara. The Solomon Islands Environmental Law Association is also part of a network here in the Pacific, which is the Pacific Network for Environmental Law, which is the law working group for the Pacific Islands Roundtable, to which SPREP is the secretariat. And this is, one of the associations that work directly with communities in building their capacity, creating awareness around rights for communities. And we hope to see more work around the area that addresses pollution for these communities. And the association is one of 3 that have been created in the region. We have one in Vanuatu, we have one in here in Fiji. So I think we have maybe 5 minutes or so, Georgina, for any questions from the audience. We have, unless we're running out of time.
Maria, you have time to answer. I see there is one question in the Q&A box. So yes, you have time for that. All
right, thank you. So we have a question from Keleni Seruvatu. Drawing on the example of the current negotiations of the BBNJ Treaty, it is critical that governments and non-state actors with relevant expertise work together and achieve productive outcomes. It's more a comment. Does anyone want to reflect on this as well from the panel? Shall I start with Sefa?
Yeah, I think this is the point I was making earlier. What NGOs, I speak as somebody who worked with a NGO for a while, so I'm not speaking as somebody who's only worked in government. The mistake that many NGOs make is that they think that they're the ones who will be negotiating. And I think we need to be quite clear that it's governments who do the negotiation. If you want to be effective, you need to set it up before you actually go to those negotiations. You have to establish the relationship with governments outside of the negotiation process so that they treat you as a trusted advisor. Those NGOs that have been able to do that are the ones who are the most effective in getting the advocacy across. I think that's the main message I have, because some NGOs make the mistake of maybe taking a more combative approach, and that doesn't work at all for anybody and defeats the purpose of what we're all working for. So it all comes down to relationships. Anything is all about relationships. We need to work together and be respectful of our various roles and responsibilities. And BBNJ is quite a good example of how NGOs have been able to be part of the process. Another one is in the whole plastics issue. There's been a lot of good teamwork between NGOs and governments. Climate change area, there's even a lot of NGOs that go as part of national delegations, which is unheard of in other countries almost. Thank you.
Patricia?
Just one short comment about that matter of the role of all stakeholders. It's interesting to see that it's built within the resolution for the plastic treaty, that there should be multi-stakeholders meeting forum just before the first meeting of the INC, and the UNEP secretary has suggested that it takes place a day before the first meeting, so that all the outcomes can be shared with the INC. So that's all built in the making of the negotiation process. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Patricia. Mason, do you want to
No,
make
just
a
to
comment?
reinforce what Sefa has said, the importance of capacity building for our government negotiators. Although we may provide the expertise, it is them that will sit in the negotiating room, and I think that's should be understood right across the region. Thank you.
Pinaka Mason, and thank you, Keleni, for the remark that you have made. It is definitely critical that experts work together and support states in negotiations. Is there any other question that we have in the chat box? We did have one from David, which we have answered. How is IUCN supporting regional and national governments to develop policies and regulations on single-use plastics in the African continent, now that plastic waste has become a critical challenge, waste management? And that has been answered by Naima. We are, we are able to get you in touch with staff from our IUCN office in the African region, should you be interested. But however, those are some of the helpful links that could address the question that you have raised. Thank you, David. We don't have any other questions for this moment, at this moment in time, but if you do have any, we are happy to in the course of this 24-hour celebration. But we would like to close the webinar with a 3-minute video of IUCN's Oceania Environmental Law Global Partnership that promotes the collaboration amongst agencies in charting a path towards strengthening environmental laws in the Pacific to meet conservation goals, as well as address the pollution crisis. So please bear with us while we play this video for you, which will bring us to the end of our session.
At the 2020 IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, the Oceania Regional Office hosted a roundtable dialogue on the future of environmental law in Oceania. This event brought together an esteemed panel of speakers to discuss the outcomes of the inaugural Oceania Environmental Law Conference and the important role of law and collaboration in nature conservation in Oceania. One key highlight of this event was the proposal made by Professor Denise Antolini to form the Oceania Environmental Law Global Partnership, or OELGP, between organizations that have a common goal for the advancement of the environmental rule of law in Oceania, which is supported by IUCN, the World Commission on Environmental Law, UNEP, and the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment.
The effective implementation of the environmental rule of law requires specialized lawyers with expertise in international, regional, national, and local environmental laws and policies. The threats of global climate and biodiversity are especially urgent for island communities in Oceania. The time is now to accelerate and amplify our efforts to create a broad network of well-trained, effective, and committed environmental lawyers working collectively across Oceania. Together, we can foster stronger connections between environmental law programs like ours and professionals across Oceania to promote the environmental rule of law, and most importantly, to make a difference in the future of the Oceania region.
Strengthening the environmental rule of law, it's an overarching goal for good environmental governance. The role of lawyers and of judges is critical to developing and upholding the environmental rule of law. We are confident that opportunities for collaboration, like the Oceania Environmental Law Programme partnership, will be conducive to such efforts.
The Montevideo Programme guides the identification and implementation of priority actions in environmental law to be undertaken by the United Nations Environment Programme in partnership with key stakeholders. The need for collaboration between environmental legal stakeholders and legal education and knowledge platforms, such as with environmental law associations and judicial institutions, is crucial if we want to enhance Oceania communities' awareness of environmental laws and their rights. We look forward to fostering this increase in environmental law capacity through various collaborative platforms like the Oceania Environmental Law Global Partnership.
On behalf of the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, I would like to congratulate the Oceania office of IUCN for putting together the Oceania Environmental Law Global Partnership. Oceania is the most important region of the world from an environmental law perspective. So it's almost natural that judges join forces because we need to learn from scientists, from law professors, from those that are working in real life with those major global environmental issues. Therefore, on behalf of my colleagues from the Global Judicial Institute on Environment, I am delighted to work together with this new initiative.
It is clear today that environmental challenges respect no borders. This means we must not only increase coordination amongst nations, but also in institutional structures that foster motivation and mobilization at all levels. Increase dialogue and partnerships across governments and non-state actors, civil society organizations, and indeed the private sector, and throughout communities at the grassroots level, is an essential and effective tool for advancing environmental law and for developing nature-based solutions to the climate crisis facing Oceania, which are inclusive, just, and culturally responsive. In addition, national, regional, and global frameworks are also needed to empower and protect the right of participation, especially by those who are vulnerable to climate change. And all partnerships must be founded on the principle of intergenerational equity.
Only together can we move forward. IUCN Oceania looks forward to working with its neighbors and partners to raise the standard of environmental law in the region and to ensure a just and sustainable future for all.
A huge thank you to IUCN Oceania for hosting that first session of the 24-hour celebration of environmental rule of law. Thank you very much, Mason and Maria, for bringing this together. Thank you very much, Patricia, for joining, and to Sefa and to Sananeva as well. Thank you, everyone. This is the end of the first session. We are going to be taking now a short break, and we'll be commencing the second session, which will look at emerging areas of environmental law to address biodiversity loss. That will start on the hour of the next hour, wherever you are in the world. So we will see you back for the second session in about 14 minutes. Thank you very much once again.